So it's our honor to have Greg Clark here, the newly elected leader of the Alberta Party. Greg was elected last September, so he's still new in the job. He's grew up in Calgary as a wife and two children, worked for Lawrence Decore in the opposition party, which gave him, I think, some of the political itch. And he's taught business management at the University of Calgary and done a number of other things that I'm not going to read through, but I invite you to give a warm Southern Alberta welcome to Greg Clark.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with SACPA. It's a remarkable organization, which I understand to be essentially unique in Alberta. And I think the contribution that SACPA makes to public discourse is remarkable, both here in Lethbridge in Southern Alberta, but I think it applies province-wide. And it is very nice to be here in a room that I've only seen on television, and thank you to Shaw for, for being here. So I will immediately answer the question, and through the course of my presentation, we'll talk a little bit more about myself, a little bit more about my background. But in answer to the question of whether or not Alberta needs a new political party, well, clearly, as leader of the Alberta Party, I think you know my answer to that. But I think we need a new political party in Alberta because the world is changing. And the expectations of the citizens of Alberta, and I would suggest of most Western liberal democracies, I think the expectations we place on our politicians are, perhaps rightly, changing. It I think is enabled largely by social media, but also by some of the large questions that we need to deal with, some of the challenging issues of our time, climate change being chief among them. It is, I think, an important time in Alberta's history. On account of issues of environmental concern and others, Albertans have to ask ourselves, how are we going to ensure that our province is economically prosperous and, as important, socially strong for generations to come? Now, as Terry mentioned, I have a couple of young daughters. My daughters are 10 and 7 years old in public school, in elementary school in Calgary. And my younger daughter, her school will not have a library next year. Why will she not have a library? Well, because the school's full, and we need to convert the library to accommodate the overwhelming number of kids in our older inner city school. And we are by no means alone, not just in Calgary. I know that there's pressures on school infrastructure and infrastructure of all kinds, healthcare and others throughout this province. But that leads us to ask, in a province with the resources of Alberta, how is that possible? How is that even acceptable? Now, clearly, I would argue that is through a complete lack of foresight and planning from a PC government that's been in power for 43 years. The types of changes and pressures that we're seeing around the world are having a significant impact. And it's a bit odd to think of that in terms of, in a time of plenty in Alberta, but I like to think of it in this way. The former chairman of General Electric, Jack Welch, once said that when the pace of change on the outside exceeds the pace of change on the inside, the end is near. And I think that very aptly describes the situation Alberta finds ourselves in. The world is trying its best to move to a low-carbon future. The world wants to address the problems of climate change, the environmental impacts of resource development on land use and water. And I think we have to ask ourselves, is Alberta going along with that change? Are we leading that change, or are we resisting that change? Is our government resisting that change? Now, I think clearly the government of Alberta has been quite intransigent in addressing environmental concerns, choosing instead to use marketing messages and spin instead of actually taking this as an opportunity to channel that entrepreneurial spirit of Alberta and to truly lead. Now, I myself am an entrepreneur, and I think the introduction today was a great first half of my personal experience and resume. But once I left politics and entered the private sector, I did a degree, a master's of business with a specialization in knowledge management, and then created a management consulting firm with a couple of partners, which we grew reasonably quickly to about 40 or 45 people. and did information and knowledge management consulting, primarily for the energy, oil, and gas industry. That experience taught me that Albertans are a very enthusiastic and entrepreneurial group. When I went to our clients who tended to be large oil and gas companies, the question wasn't, well, what large firm do you represent? Who were your parents? What school did you go to? The question was, well, now that's great. When can you start? That sounds like a great idea. We should do that. There's this very open and accepting culture in Alberta. What I love about this place is what you get out of Alberta is almost exactly the same as what you put in. And I think we maybe don't realize how fortunate we are to have that culture. Unfortunately, that culture is not carried over into our provincial government. So, do we need a new political party? Well, a lot of people I talk with say that they're finished with the PC party. Now, maybe they never supported them in the first place. They also say, you know, the Wild Rose Party doesn't represent my values, so I'm looking for something on the moderate side of the political spectrum, which brings us to Alberta's Liberals. Now, as you know, I was part of that party dating back 20 years plus to the time of Lawrence Decore. There are a lot of very good people in the Alberta Liberal Party. Unfortunately, whether it's fair or not, Alberta's Liberals have not earned the trust of Albertans, have never captured the imagination of Albertans. And coming from a high of nearly 40% of the popular vote in 1993 to less than 10% in the 2012 general election, I think we have to ask ourselves whether we feel the Alberta Party, or the Alberta Liberal Party, is in fact on the right track, if in fact there is a chance there for the Alberta Liberals to ever form government. The decision I made was that I don't think that there is, which is unfortunate, but I think it's a reality. Alberta's New Democrats I admire very much. They're the conscience of the legislature. I know Brian Mason was here to speak with you not so long ago. I watched that on Shaw TV, and you know, Brian and Alberta's New Democrats do an excellent job in holding the government to account. We have to ask ourselves if there's a path to government for Alberta's New Democrats. I think they're an excellent opposition, but what Alberta needs is not a better opposition. Alberta needs a better government. So, with Albertans being this optimistic, problem-solving group who are connected to our communities, and I think that's broadly true, certainly amongst this crowd of people who've come out to hear a burgeoning politician speak. Why is it that we see this long-term trend of declining voter turnout? There was a study recently by Samara Canada that showed 55% of Canadians are satisfied with how democracy works. So that number just barely half. It was 75% barely 10 years ago in 2004. The people of Canada, and I think we can extrapolate this to Albertans, it was a national study, and I think this applies equally to Alberta, they believe the primary role of the elected official, of an MP or an MLA, is to represent the views of the government rather than to represent the views of the people who elected them. And you may be surprised to find out that members of Parliament feel the same way. In the same study, Samara quoted an MP as saying, "I realized early on that you're there to vote the party's position, more or less, or you're there to represent the party to the public." Now, I think that's entirely backwards, and I'm sure the people in this room would agree. I believe the number one role of an MLA ought to be to represent the views of their constituents in the Alberta legislature, and not the other way around. I believe that in Alberta, and everywhere, the government ought to work for us. We shouldn't feel like we have to work for them. The government ought to be afraid of us in a representative democracy, not that we should be afraid of the government. Now, here's some tangible examples of that. The government of Alberta did a budget consultation, I'll use air quotes, consultation, through their budget choice website ahead of the 2013 budget. 70% of Albertans, of the 30+ thousand Albertans who took that survey, indicated they were in favor of progressive income tax, or they were in favor of increasing corporate taxes to fund key programs like health and education. Have we done that? Have we seen that in our provincial government? We haven't. I can only imagine for ideological reasons. 75% of Albertans have indicated they're in favor of a carbon tax as a way of addressing climate change and constraining continued growth of carbon. Have we seen an increase in Alberta's carbon tax? We haven't. And I think it's notable that the likely next leader of the PC party and next Premier of Alberta, Jim Prentice, has indicated he has no interest in addressing climate change through increased carbon taxes. Again, I think we have a government who is disconnected from the views and the wishes of Albertans for reasons I frankly don't fully understand. But I do think that this perhaps explains why we are so unhappy with our political choices, because we look out in the political landscape and we see politicians who act like politicians. So my goal and what I endeavor to do as unfortunately, I guess I have to call myself a politician, is not to act like one. So my goal is always to answer a question in as genuine and authentic way as I can, even frankly if that's not what the person who's asked the question wants to hear. And I'll do so as respectfully as I can. And the other thing I've committed to myself, and my assistant Tony helps keep me on the straight and narrow in this one, it's very easy to say one thing to one person and something entirely different to someone else. I think we see it from our politicians all the time. All I think we can ask for is say what you're going to do and do what you'll say. And that will, I think, rebuild trust in Alberta politics. Another way to do that is through, I think, one of my favorite policies of the Alberta Party. We have an MLA guideline that outlines what it means to be an Alberta Party MLA. The best example, I think, is from someone who ran for the Alberta Party in 2012, Tim Osborne. He's now a city councillor in the city of St. Albert. What our MLA guideline talks about is how we will consult with the people who elect us. There's a requirement for us to consult in person, to hold town hall meetings, to be personally available and accessible to our constituents, but also to maintain a significant online presence, to maintain a social media presence, and to have a web access. What Tim does, before every city council meeting, he will write a summary of the issues that will come before city council, and he solicits input from his constituents. Once the city council meeting has happened and he's voted one way or another on those issues, he will write a brief summary in plain language what those issues were. And he'll say, I thought about this, I voted in favor of this for these reasons, I took the input of my constituents, I applied my personal values that I told you about when I was elected, and I also thought about the best interests of the city of St. Albert, and that's why I voted the way I voted. If you have any questions, please let me know. Here's my personal email address and my cell number, or come visit me and have a coffee in my office. That level of total accountability and total transparency is the key to engaging people in the political process, to reverse that long-term trend of declining voter turnout by creating elected officials who truly serve in the public interest, do it for the people who elect them out of a sense of service rather than out of a sense of self-aggrandizement or power. Now, what I find interesting is municipal politicians very often reflect their communities back to the people who've elected them. And I think that's largely because the issues that they tend to deal with are the kinds of issues that are closer to home. And also, they're part of your community. You'll see them down at the grocery store. Your kids might play soccer together. And so there's that greater connection. But I also think the people who tend to go into municipal politics do it because they care so much about their communities. Now, there are some very good people in provincial politics. But there seems to be a disconnection that happens as those people become higher up within the provincial political ranks. As they strive to achieve power, they become more disconnected from their communities. I'd like to see a political class, or the folks who represent us in the Alberta legislature, reestablish that connection to their community. And I think one way of doing that is to ensure that the Alberta legislature works a little bit more like a city council, where we're not focused on rigid political ideologies, where there's less command and control, less party discipline, and a far greater opportunity for free votes. So I've talked about the Alberta Party MLA guideline. The other thing that talks about is how we will handle the question of free votes. So of course the Alberta Party is a strong supporter of free votes as a party that believes in representative democracy, but not in every case. There are two situations where Alberta Party MLAs would be required to vote with the government. The first is the budget, which is a requirement to keep the government running. And the second is if there's a government bill that keeps an election promise. The idea being that if you were elected as an Alberta Party MLA, based on a certain series of promises, you ought to vote in favor of that to enact those, the legislation that keeps that election promise. Beyond that, it's a free vote. And what I envision happening is a government bill that doesn't meet one of those two criteria comes before the legislature. Our MLAs consult their constituents, and let's say half a dozen Alberta Party MLAs say, you know, the people who elected me don't like this. Here's why I think that it's not great for the province of Alberta. I'm going to choose to vote against this government bill. Now, Dave and others in the media would lose their minds the minute that happened. There would be this great hue and cry, oh my goodness, it's a failure of leadership. The knives are out for the leader of the Alberta Party, for the Premier. The bill would either pass or fail. The sun would rise in the east the next morning. Time would pass. Another bill would come before the legislature, and perhaps 4 Alberta Party MLAs would choose to vote against that bill for their reasons. But maybe 2 or 3 opposition MLAs would get the hang of the free vote and say, you know, I'm going to vote in favor of that. I like what that stands for. Or perhaps I'm going to propose an amendment to make this stronger legislation. Perhaps the amendment would pass or fail on its own merits, without consideration of larger political impacts. I spend a fair bit of time at the legislature, and especially in the rare times when the legislature is sitting, I will tend to go up and observe question period. I talked to a PC MLA in light of Bill 45 and 46, the odious anti-union bills of last fall. And she said, you know, there were 4 or 5 very sound amendments that were presented to Bills 45 and 46 that, had we accepted those, would have made this quite powerful and strong legislation. But we were not allowed to even consider those amendments because we were told by our political masters that it was not something expedient from a political perspective. Now that, to me, I think is the truest story of where our democracy and our parliamentary system, and especially in Alberta, our legislative system, is fundamentally broken. We need a different approach, a different mindset, driven by, I believe, a new political party. Now, I've gone a little off script here, so I have to get back on track. One of the sayings that we used in my career as a knowledge management consultant was, all of us know more than one of us, which I think really speaks to the collaborative approach, the idea that the wisdom of crowds will take us in the right direction. How can that apply then to public policy in Alberta? Well, I think if we were to take an issue like climate change or environmental regulation, there's 2 ways I think we need to tackle that problem. Government has a role in passing legislation around things like carbon taxes, around things like environmental regulations, around enforcement, around water use and land use. Those big issues are things that the government needs to be very, very strongly focused on. How exactly we go about reducing the impact of climate change and reducing carbon emissions, I think should be opened to the public. I think we should challenge Albertans, the entrepreneurial, innovative, very bright Albertans that we have. Help us solve that problem. Don't just simply sit in a small group behind closed doors and try to come up with it yourselves. There are models for this out in the world. The United States government has a website called challenge.gov. Are you familiar with this site? It actually hosts contests and asks Americans to help the government solve problems. You actually win prizes. So for small things, you perhaps win just some recognition for having come up with an interesting idea. There's a contest to create an iPhone app to help deal with disaster planning. There are large-scale projects. Currently, if you go to challenge.gov, there's a $15 million prize to the person or company who can come up with a way of making light bulbs more energy efficient. That's a big problem. If we can solve that problem, the return on that is potentially exponential. So I think we can apply that same mindset where we're asking Albertans and engaging with Albertans in a very genuine and authentic way and saying, well, how do you think we can deal with these particular problems? How do you think we can reduce carbon emissions in Alberta? How do you think we can deal with land use or water use? And it's not just individuals, it is industry as well. I think that creating a very open and collaborative innovation ecosystem is the answer to the challenges that face our province. So we need a government that's willing to act openly, to be transparent and create that culture of transparency and innovation in government, one that matches the values and the culture of Albertans. And where there's transparency, there's trust. And where there's trust, there's an opportunity for transformation. To do that, we need a government that will enact specific policies that are supportive of that. The what that we do in politics, the specific line items, it matters a huge amount. How we go about doing that, the mindset, the attitude, and the culture, it matters just as much. Thank you very much.